There is a line in Shakespeare's Hamlet that has been quoted more times than almost any other line in the play, and it has almost nothing to do with the plot. And she says, simply, "There's rosemary, that's for remembrance. Pray you, love, remember." Shakespeare was not being poetic. He was quoting a fact that everyone in his audience already knew. The association between rosemary and memory was not invented by the playwright. It was old when Shakespeare was born. It was old when the medieval monks who grew it in their monastery gardens were born. It was old when the Roman soldiers who packed it in their field medicine kits were born. How old? Old enough that it may say something important about what human beings have always understood before they had any scientific way to verify it, about the relationship between the natural world and the interior life. This is the history of rosemary. And unlike most herbs, which have one story, rosemary has several, because it is the only plant in the Western tradition that appears at every significant threshold of human existence. From birth to death, from love to grief, from healing to protection. The same sprig of leaves that a bride carried into her wedding was the same sprig that was placed on her coffin. The same plant that Roman students wore in their hair during examinations was the same plant that medieval doctors burned in the streets during plague. That is not a coincidence. That is what it looks like when a culture, over centuries and across generations, is paying very close attention to something real. Start where the written record starts, which is ancient Greece. The Greeks had a word for memory. It was Mnemasine, and Mnemasine was not just a word. She was a goddess, one of the Titans, daughter of Uranus and Gaia, mother of the 9 muses who governed all the arts and sciences. Memory, in the Greek understanding, was not a cognitive function. It was divine. And the plant associated with Mnemasine was rosemary. Greek students wore crowns and garlands of rosemary during their studies and their examinations, believing that the plant enhanced their ability to retain and recall information. This was not a superstition practiced by a few credulous individuals. It was a widespread cultural practice, documented by multiple sources across several centuries of Greek intellectual life. The students believed it worked, and they were. As it turns out, practicing something that modern neuroscience has since confirmed has a measurable biological basis. Dioscorides, the Greek physician who wrote De Materia Medica in the 1st century, the botanical and medical encyclopedia that remained the primary reference for Western medicine for 1500 years, prescribed rosemary for headaches, for weakness of the nerves, for digestive problems, and as a general restorative tonic. He was recording an already established tradition, not inventing a new one. The Greeks had been using this plant medicinally for centuries before Dioscorides gave its systematic description. The Romans, who absorbed so much of Greek knowledge, along with everything else they absorbed, made rosemary ubiquitous in their culture. They cooked with it, they prescribed it, they burned it in their temples as an offering to the gods, they used it in their funeral rites, and they carried it in both senses. Roman soldiers packed rosemary in their field kits for wound treatment. The Roman name for the plant, rosmarinas, is where the English word rosemary eventually arrives. It means dew of the sea. The plant grew where almost nothing else could, in conditions of salt and stone and relentless sun, and it thrived. The Romans noticed that a plant which should sustain itself in those conditions, which could grow dense and fragrant and vital and rocky, mineral-poor soil by the sea, might have something worth investigating more closely. They were right. Now here is the detail that makes rosemary unlike almost any other plant in the Western herbal tradition. It was used simultaneously for the 2 most opposite human experiences. In ancient Rome and across medieval Europe, rosemary was present at weddings and at funerals, not alternately. Both. At the same time, as part of the same cultural understanding of what the plant represented, brides carried rosemary because it symbolized that the love being formed would be remembered. Grooms received sprigs of it from their new families for the same reason. Guests at weddings were given rosemary dipped in scented water as a reminder that this day was worth keeping, that what was beginning here should not be forgotten. In some regions of medieval England, the wedding rosemary was gilded. its stems wrapped in colored ribbon, and given to guests as a keepsake they were expected to keep for the rest of their lives. And then, when someone died, rosemary was placed on the coffin. It was thrown into the open grave. Mourners carried sprigs of it and held them throughout the burial. In many traditions, the rosemary was placed directly on the body before burial. Herbalists and household manuals of the 16th and 17th centuries describe both uses without any apparent sense of contradiction, because there was no contradiction. The plant served the same function in both contexts. The reason was exactly the same, that the person who had just departed should be remembered, that this life mattered and should not be forgotten. The same plant, the same meaning. Both occasions. This tells you something essential about how ancient peoples understood rosemary, not as a wedding herb or a funeral herb, but as a threshold herb, the plant that marked the moments when something changed forever, when a person crossed from one state of existence into another, when the community gathered to witness and to say, "We will not forget what happened here." There's rosemary, that's for remembrance. This dual role is documented in herbals, in literary texts, in household records, and in travelers' accounts across more than 2,000 years of European culture. It appears in ancient Rome, in medieval England, in Renaissance Italy, in colonial America. Wherever European culture went, the rosemary went with it, and wherever it went, it appeared at weddings and at funerals, fulfilling the same function it had always fulfilled, marking the crossings that mattered most, in between the weddings and the funerals. Rosemary was also the most versatile and most widely used medicinal plant in the Western tradition. The medieval monasteries of Europe, which served as the medical system for the populations around them in the centuries following the fall of Rome, cultivated rosemary in their physic gardens as a primary plant. It appeared in the medical texts of virtually every significant monastic tradition in Western Europe. It appeared in the Hortulis of Walafrid Strabo in the 9th century. It appeared in the Physica of Hildegard von Bingen in the 12th century, where she described it as good for the heart, beneficial for the mind, and effective against various ailments of the nervous system and the digestive tract. Hildegard was working from observation and from accumulated tradition that she had access to through her role as a boss and through her extensive reading. She could not have known anything about the molecular composition of rosemary's essential oil. She was recording what generations of people who had used this plant carefully had concluded about what it did, and she was, on the evidence of what modern pharmacology has since established, largely correct in her conclusions. The herb was prescribed for circulatory problems because it was observed to stimulate blood flow and warm the body. It was prescribed for joint pain and muscle complaints because it was observed to reduce inflammation when applied as a preparation or taken internally. It was prescribed for depression and low spirits because it was observed to lift the mood and restore energy in people who used it regularly. It was prescribed for digestive complaints because it was observed to ease the stomach and support appetite. And it was prescribed, always, for problems of memory and mental clarity, because generations of observation had established that this was one of its most consistent and reliable effects. One medieval saying that circulated across European herbalism summed up the plant's reputation: "Smell it often, and it shall keep thee youngly." This was not an idle claim. It reflected what accumulated observation had found, that regular contact with rosemary, whether through cooking with it, working near it, or simply handling it, seemed to maintain the sharpness of the mind into later years in a way that was noticeable to those around the person who used it. This accumulation of practical medical knowledge about rosemary reached a moment of formal codification in the 14th century, with the creation of what is considered one of the first alcohol-based perfumes in European history. The preparation was called Hungary water, or the Queen of Hungary's water, and its origin is attached to a story whose exact details historians continue to debate, but whose broad outlines are consistent across multiple sources. Around 1370, a formulation of rosemary distilled in alcohol was created for the Hungarian royal court, associated in most accounts with Queen Elizabeth of Hungary. The specific creator varies by source: a hermit monk, a court alchemist. What all the accounts agree on is the preparation and its effect. Rosemary, concentrated in alcohol to a potency that no previous preparation had achieved. Hungary water spread rapidly across European courts and eventually into general use. It was used as a perfume, as a medicine, as a skin treatment, as a restorative tonic taken internally in small quantities, and as a preparation massaged into painful joints. The earliest recorded recipes list rosemary as the primary ingredient, sometimes combined with thyme, lavender, and mint for several centuries, until it was eventually supplanted by eau de cologne in the 18th century. Hungary water was the most widely used aromatic preparation in Europe. It was also, as modern chemical analysis has confirmed, doing some of what it was claimed to do. The rosmarinic acid and carnosic acid concentrated in rosemary essential oil have demonstrated genuine antimicrobial properties in laboratory settings. The alcohol base was itself antimicrobial at the concentrations used, but the combination of compounds it delivered was not pharmacologically inert. The people who produced and used it were working with something real, even if their explanations of why it worked were framed in the only vocabulary available to them. By the time of the Great Plagues that devastated European populations from the 14th century onward, rosemary had acquired another role: protection from contagion. Medieval doctors wore robes and carried bunches of aromatic herbs, including rosemary, to their encounters with the sick, believing that the smell of putrefaction and the miasma it produced was itself a carrier of disease, and that strong aromatic plants could neutralize it. The streets of plague-stricken cities were sometimes fumigated with burning bundles of rosemary. Houses were strewn with it on their floors. People carried small bags of it on their bodies. The theory behind the practice was wrong. Plague is transmitted by bacteria and by fleas, not by smell. But the practice itself was not entirely without effect. Rosemary smoke does have genuine antimicrobial properties, have demonstrated significant antibacterial and antifungal activity in laboratory studies. Whether burning rosemary in a street was enough to meaningfully reduce bacterial load is doubtful, but the instinct to reach for this plant in a health crisis was not baseless. It reflected an accumulated cultural understanding that this plant had properties relevant to the body's ability to resist disease, an understanding that was correct in ways that people who held it could not have explained in the language of modern microbiology. By the 17th century, when Shakespeare put rosemary in Ophelia's hands, the plant had been in continuous use for memory, for love, for grief, for healing, and for protection for at least 2,000 years. The line Shakespeare wrote was not an artistic invention. It was a cultural citation. The audience knew exactly what he meant. They had been hearing it their entire lives. And here is where the history opens into something that rewards closer attention. The compound in rosemary, primarily responsible for its cognitive effects, is adienceiniol, also known as euc. It is present in significant concentrations in rosemary essential oil and is released into the air when the plant is bruised, cut, or exposed to heat. Unlike many aromatic compounds, adienceiniol can cross the blood-brain barrier. Once in the brain, it inhibits an enzyme called acetylcholine, whose function is to break down acetylcholine, the primary neurotransmitter involved in memory formation, attention, and the processing of new information. When acetylcholinesterase is inhibited, acetylcholinase levels in the brain remain elevated for longer. This is, incidentally, the same mechanism of action as several pharmaceutical drugs currently used in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, which work precisely by inhibiting acetylcholinesterase to maintain higher acetylcholine levels and thereby slow the progression of memory loss. The Greek students who wore rosemary crowns during their examinations were without any knowledge of neurotransmitters or blood-brain barriers, or enzyme inhibition, doing something that modern pharmacology would now identify as having a genuine biological basis. They were not practicing superstition. They were practicing something that worked through a mechanism they had no conceptual vocabulary to describe, that 2,000 years of subsequent scientific development has now documented with precision. The clinical research confirming this is specific and worth examining closely. Studies led by Dr. Mark Moss and his team at Northumbria University in England exposed participants to the aroma of rosemary essential oil and then measured their performance on a range of memory tasks. including prospective memory tasks that require remembering to do something at a future point, which is arguably the most practically significant form of memory in daily life. The participants who had been exposed to the rosemary aroma performed significantly better than those in an unscented environment. More importantly, the study measured blood plasma levels of 18-cineol in the participants and found a direct and statistically significant correlation between the concentration of the compound in the blood and the quality of memory performance. The higher the 18-cineol level, the better the score. This is not a vague aromatherapy claim about mood or well-being. This is a specific dose-response relationship between a measurable biochemical marker and a measurable cognitive outcome, published in the journal Therapeutic Advances in Psychopharmacology. It is the kind of result that satisfies the criteria for scientific evidence in ways that most herbal research does not. Research has also documented rosemary's effects that go considerably beyond the cognitive. The rosmarinic acid in rosemary has demonstrated anti-inflammatory properties in multiple peer-reviewed studies, working through pathways relevant to conditions from arthritis and inflammatory bowel disease to asthma. The carnosic acid in rosemary has demonstrated antioxidant activity that protects cells against oxidative stress, one of the mechanisms associated with aging, cardiovascular disease, and neurodegeneration. Rosmarinic acid has also shown antiviral properties against certain viruses in laboratory conditions. Studies examining rosemary's effects on circulation have found evidence consistent with the historical observation that the plant stimulates blood flow and warms the body through mechanisms that are now being mapped at the molecular level. Research into its potential role in cancer prevention has identified compounds in rosemary that show activity against certain tumor cell lines in laboratory settings, a direction of research that remains early but that has generated enough consistent preliminary findings to sustain ongoing investigation. The antimicrobial properties of rosemary compounds, particularly relevant to the medieval use of the plant during plague, have been confirmed in laboratory studies. Rosmarinic acid and carnosic acid show significant activity against a range of bacteria, including some strains that have developed resistance to conventional antibiotics. The medieval doctor who burned rosemary in a sick room was not providing effective treatment for plague, but they were not operating without any biological logic. The compounds they were releasing into the air had genuine antimicrobial properties. The theory was wrong. The instinct was not entirely baseless. All of this was known without any of the scientific vocabulary by people across the Mediterranean world for more than 2,000 years. The Roman soldier who packed rosemary for wound care, the medieval monk who prescribed it for poor circulation and low spirits, the Greek student who wore it in their hair, the bride who carried it at her wedding, the mourner who threw it into a grave. All of them were operating within a tradition of careful observation that identified, through generations of use and sustained attention, properties that modern science has now confirmed, using instruments and methods that none of them could have imagined. This is the pattern that recurs in the history of the plants that have stayed closest to human civilization across the longest periods of time. Not randomness, not superstition. Observation. Patient, accumulated, multi-generational. Observation passed forward in the form of practices that looked, from the outside, like tradition or ritual or folk belief, but that were functionally experiments that had already been run, evaluated, refined, and retained because they produced results. The people who carried rosemary to their weddings were not doing so because someone told them it was romantic. They were doing it because generations of observation had established, in the way that pre-scientific cultures establish things, through repeated use across enough people over enough time, that this plant had something to do with the capacity to hold on to what mattered, that it was connected. In some way they could feel but not explain to the human ability to keep love and loss and memory alive. They were not wrong. They were just working in a vocabulary that predated the laboratory. What does it mean that a plant growing on rocky Mediterranean cliffs contains compounds that cross the blood-brain barrier and affect the chemistry of human memory? What does it mean that this effect was reliably observed by Greek students 2,000 years before anyone had a word for a neurotransmitter, and that it was so consistently observed across so many cultures for so long that Shakespeare could put it in the mouth of a grieving girl in 1601 and every person in the theater would understand immediately what he meant. It means that the natural world and the human nervous system are not as separate as the modern division between pharmacy and nature might suggest. It means that what grows in the rocky places, in the thin soil, by the salt air, has been attending to us for as long as we have been attending to it, and that the relationship between human beings and the plants that have stayed close to us across millennia is a conversation that was not one-sided. The tradition of paying close, patient, multi-generational attention to the natural world, of trusting that what the world offers contains help for what we need, and of being willing to pass that trust forward through time even without being able to explain it, is a form of knowledge that the modern world has largely traded for a different kind. Not without gains, but not without losses either. The knowledge of Rosemary's compounds now lives in peer-reviewed papers in pharmacology journals. The knowledge of what it meant to carry it, to grow it at the doorstep, to reach for it at the moments that mattered most, that lives in a different place, in the continuation of a tradition older than any scientific institution, in the act of paying attention to what the world around you is actually doing. If this kind of attention, the willingness to look more closely at what is right in front of you and find that it contains more than you expected, speaks to something in how you want to move through the world. The ebook, Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence, explores exactly that territory. The depth that exists beneath the surface of ordinary experience, and the interior life that opens when you pay the kind of attention that the ancient world paid to a sprig of rosemary. The link is in the description. And the thought that stays when everything in this history has settled. The ancient Greeks did not need modern science to tell them what rosemary did. They needed only to wear it, to pay attention, and to pass forward what they found. 2,000 years later, the instruments of neuroscience caught up to what their students already knew. What else is out there in the natural world and in the interior life that is still waiting for the instruments to catch up?